Welcome, Travis Lawrence with Arrow ECS. Today we're going to discuss 5 technical tips to get you started with vCloud Air. Specifically, a few items for those of you especially that aren't familiar with the service. What does it look like from a GUI perspective, but also what are a handful of things that you can use to start off for you to get familiar that you can really pass on to your customers so they can become familiar with the offering. Specifically, we'll talk about choosing the appropriate service. So there you may have heard words like dedicated cloud, virtual private cloud, DR as a service. We'll go over those offerings at a high level so you can understand what they are, so you can differentiate for conversations with your customer. And then we'll get into a little more detail about the service components in each of those offerings. So we can understand, well, why are they different? What components do they have that are different? And that brings us back to kind of use cases so you can understand specifically for those customer use cases which offering goes with which customer need. And then we'll talk a little bit about service subscriptions. How do we build a vCloud Air quote? Again, we want to keep this fairly high level, so we won't go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's important that you understand what that looks like, how we have the base offering, the core offering as it were, and then going into a little bit more detail around what that looks like. And then we'll talk about moving workloads. So rather than, the conversion or migration conversations we have with other public cloud offerings, I think it's really important for you to understand that at a high level, that if you have on-premises vSphere, it's very, very easy for us to migrate those or move those workloads into vCloud Air. And then last, we'll take a look here at this, the actual interface and get a little bit more detail. I think I'm a very visual person, so it's very helpful for us to dive into that interface and see what that looks like. And so you get that, kind of connect the dots as to, well, on-premises vSphere looks like this. What does vCloud Air look like from a different perspective? So let us jump into, I really like to do live demos. This is a live demo here, but it's best when we can kind of set the stage with a few of those items. So talking a bit about service opportunities, we'll look at a few things here. So when we're talking service opportunities, really what that means for us is this level here. When we're talking between dedicated cloud, virtual private cloud, and disaster recovery. So dedicated cloud is really physically isolated compute. So for mid to large size customers, or any customers really that need that air-gapped infrastructure where the compute resources are isolated from other tenants within vCloud Air, this would be the offering you would start with. So it's really, VMware terms it as your own private cloud, but it is really that physical isolation. It's also a larger amount of compute and memory. We'll get into that in a minute. But the second offering is really virtual private cloud. You also may hear this termed VPC, but this is a logically isolated resource that customers can leverage. And this is really has a wide variety of use cases from full-on DR and failover scenarios, or smaller customers, or even larger customers that just want to sort of build as they go, add on those components and don't necessarily need that dedicated cloud instance. And then finally we have the disaster recovery instance, so DR as a service. This is really a warm standby for customers that they can leverage if they don't really need the always-on functionality of the dedicated cloud or VPC. They can leverage the DR as a service piece and still have that logically isolated instance, but it's really a warm standby where we leverage that for test instances to test our failovers, or for an actual DR instance we can failover for up to 30 days, and then if we need to we can add on additional time onto that instance if needed beyond that 30-day recovery period. So getting a little bit more into this, that's really choosing between those different appropriate services. If we want to dig in a little bit more about each service component, we can see here fairly simply what the differences are at each of these levels here. So we're talking about, base compute resources, storage, and then finally at the bottom, the networking components. And we won't get into a lot of these, but really understanding that, again, when we talked about dedicated cloud, you're getting dedicated cloud instance, so we're getting a lot more compute, 120 gigabytes of VRAM, 30 gigahertz of vCPU. Contrasting that with VPC and disaster recovery, where we're getting 20 gigabytes of VRAM for each of these and 10 gigahertz of vCPU. So you can kind of see when you're working with customers, it's best to understand, okay, at a high level, we're talking about dedicated cloud, VPC, DR. I think it's very simple to, once we understand the customer's critical business issue, as to which bucket they really fit in. But then when we drill down a little bit more into these base resources, we start to understand, well, what would be the difference? If we understand this is for a production workload, is it something that really needs more resources, or is it something that we can use VPC for and kind of scale that as we go? So we also see the differences here. Dedicated cloud has a larger amount of storage, 6 terabytes, and then these instances of VPC and DR as a service really have differing storages, 2 terabytes and 1 terabyte respectively. And then on the networking piece, we can see the differences down there. So again, we're not trying to get too far into details, but I think this is a good picture to have in your mind when you're having a conversation with a customer around vCloud Air, so they can really understand what those pieces are. And even if we bring this slide deck and say, okay, this is what I would recommend from a reseller's perspective to your customers, but then we can also help them be a part of that decision-making process. So after talking about each of those service components and having a little bit more detail around that, we're talking a little bit about service subscriptions. So here we can kind of see of how we build a core vCloud Air quote and then what we add on top of that. So when we start with this component, the only part that's really required is this piece down here where we see the dedicated cloud and VPC instance. So we buy on the previous slide, we can see each of those core instances, as we call them, and from there that's where we build on. So a customer may purchase a SKU that has all of those components on the previous page, but from there they can either add additional core components or they can add each of these different subscription-based, usage-based, or time-based components. So if a customer, say, buys as a smaller customer, they want to start out with a VPC instance, they can do that, but say they need additional primary storage. In that scenario, they can buy the VPC instance here, and then they can build on or add on just additional components of primary storage without having to increase the compute or networking components in that same fashion. So they can really customize the service the way that they need to and build out that VPC instance in their own fashion, as it were. And there's also components that are usage-based, so things like bandwidth, service catalog items, meaning things like Windows licensing purchased from VMware. These pieces can be added on additionally as well, but they're more based on usage rather than, a subscription where I'm going to get 2 additional terabytes of storage per month. And then finally, we have some one-time costs. So for larger virtual machine environments where we want to move those VMs into the cloud, say we have a 1 terabyte file server VM we want to move into vCloud Air, we can use things like offline data transfer. So ODT is something where we can take a 4 terabyte encrypted NAS that VMware will overnight to a customer. They can load those virtual machine or multiple virtual machines onto that and then ship that back to vCloud Air. The vCloud Air team will upload that into the cloud. Similarly, for DR as a service, there may be additional compute needs. So say we fail over and we have our 30-day window and we realize, once we're failing over, we need additional compute resources. We can add those on as a one-time component during that DR event. And then we can also do things like failover testing. As I mentioned, 30 days is the standard component included with DR as a service, but if we need to add on additional time, we can do that at a one-time fee as well. And then the final piece when we're talking about moving workloads, so moving existing applications without re-architecting them. This is probably one of the biggest pieces for customers that have VMware vSphere on premises now. It's just very easy for us to move those VMs. We're not converting them. We don't have to do any kind of conversion process or actually rebuild a virtual machine into a specific format. And that is the issue. I think there's a slow rate of adoption in many environments just because they don't have the means or understanding of how do I move this application or how do I convert this VM or rebuild this application to get it into a public cloud offering. And once I'm there, what kind of tools and pieces do I have to learn and manage once I've got this environment where some of my workloads on premises are in a vSphere environment and then offline or in the public cloud, they're managed and converted in a completely different way. So we can see here, the first point of note is since we're running vSphere in vCloud Air, we can run all of the same operating systems and applications that are certified on premises. So many of these enterprise corporations have gone through probably years of testing and certification, making sure that their applications are certified to run on vSphere. Well, we know that those workloads will run well in vCloud Air because it's the same underlying infrastructure. So we don't have to go through sort of that recertification process, calling those vendors, getting guarantees, getting in writing that those VMs will run well in the cloud, because we're running that same infrastructure in vCloud Air that we have in our on-premises location. So more than 90 operating systems, 5,000 applications, we know that that is tried and true as far as running those VMs. Now, moving those VMs into vCloud Air, there's a variety of ways. We mentioned the bottom bullet point there, offline data transfer. We've also got, so we can take that NAS and have that shipped. For other workloads, we can actually do an OVF import, so we can convert that to open virtualization format and direct connect into vCloud Air, migrate those VMs that way. Or we can leverage VMware vCloud Connector as another way to migrate that in. But again, it's really the importance here is we don't have to make changes to that virtual machine. We can move it out to vCloud Air, we can move it back. It's a very simple process overall. So let's take a look at the vCloud Air interface. And again, as I mentioned, I think this is really important because a lot of us are visual, and it's helpful to see what the interface looks like, how it differs a little bit from vSphere, but yet how it has some continuity between that. So this really covers step 5 of the 5 steps that we talked about, really administering the cloud resources in an environment. So this is what a customer would see. So we log in with username and password. And this can be done from any web browser. So again, a benefit of this being publicly accessible, we are often managing a hybrid environment where we have on-premises vSphere and vCloud Air, but this way we can log in using any type of browser. Here I'm going to select my subscriptions, and the application will load. From here we'll see the different types of data centers. So depending on the customer and maybe even the group that they are really have permissions in, they'll see different types of data centers. So dedicated cloud customers may have different instances in VPC customers, DR as a service, and what have you. In this case, I have 2 different data centers. So I have a US Nevada data center that is a VPC instance, and I also have a US Virginia data center instance. This is actually a DR as a service component that we can see. We can tell that here by the storage allocation, but we also know that when we purchase that, that's the offering that we selected for the customer, or that the customer selected. Again, it is important when we're thinking about the packaging and pricing sort of piece of that is when a customer is selecting, you want to assist them as a reseller with location. So if we're having a primary data center, we may want to choose that VPC instance close to where the customers are going to be, so we get better performance. But if we're thinking about DR as a service, we would select that SKU or that offering based on that. So if we are our primary locations in Nevada and we want to have a DR instance in Virginia, that means if we have a disaster, we're farther away from that, and the likelihood that we can bring that resource back online is greater. But a little bit more about this, we see some service tag information that's helpful for identifying different instances and helping with troubleshooting with VMware support. And then more importantly, we see our virtual data center. So you see VDC here, that means virtual data center. Within a virtual private cloud, we only have 1 VDC per instance, but with a dedicated cloud instance, you can carve that up into multiple virtual data centers. So say you have different business units, marketing could have a different virtual data center from some of the other maybe engineering or R&D groups. We can also see here the amount of resources that are provided per instance. So in this case, these will be, when we talked about VPC and dedicated cloud, DR as a service, these items here will match those amounts. But if we drill down in, let's look a little bit more at our Nevada data center. So once we drill into this, we can see again the amount of overall capacity that we have. So CPU, memory, and storage. In the storage tab, we can also drill down and see if that's SSD accelerated or a standard tier of storage. We can see other high-level information, so virtual machines, number of public IPs we have allocated. And again, as I mentioned, with a DR instance, or rather with a VPC instance, we have a single virtual data center per instance. With dedicated cloud, we could actually carve up these overall resources you see above into multiple virtual data centers at the bottom. So if we scroll down a bit here, we can see what the specific usage is for this VPC instance. So you'll note that maybe at the top where I have 10 gigahertz of compute, down here at the bottom, we'll see where we have the amount used. So we're using about half of our CPU allocation. We're using a 4.5 gigs of memory allocation, and then we're using a portion of our storage allocation. So that's really, this gives us visibility into our actual usage versus up here at the top where we're our overall amount provided. But if we drill down into this piece, we'll see a bit more about our specific VPC instance. So again, we see the overall amount utilized. I think it's the most representative part of this is if you're talking to a vSphere administrator, they want to understand, well, what's it going to look like when I log into and access this particular virtual machine. So if I click on the Virtual Machines tab, I can see the number of VMs I have running in my vCloud Air instance. And again, one of the big benefits of vCloud Air is we can size these virtual machines however we want to. That also helps with our moving. We move a virtual machine from our on-premises data center into the cloud. We don't have to try to adjust that. You see a lot of other public cloud models that use what's called t-shirt sizing. So if we have an on-premises VM that has one virtual CPU and 8 gigs of memory, if we're moving that into a public cloud, we may have to either rebuild that virtual machine or recreate it because they don't have a 1 vCPU 8 gig of memory model. They may have a small or extra small or medium VM that has preset amounts of those resources, and we have to kind of deal with that and squeeze that virtual machine into that type with some type of conversion process or rebuild process. So that's what's great about vCloud Air. If I buy one VPC instance, I could create one monster VM that uses all of that compute and memory and storage, or I could build a lot of smaller VMs like I have in this scenario, where we kind of carve that up as needed. But here again, you can see kind of an overview of the name of the virtual machine, the owner of the VM, and then the CPU and memory resources, what operating systems it's running, and then which vApp, which is a vCloud director construct that's there. We can also see the tag of the virtual data center that it's in. But we can also see some other functionality that we have. If we select a virtual machine and open up a menu, we can see that we've got the normal functions that we have within vCenter, but within this web interface. So we can see if we wanted to, we could edit the details of the VM, we can power it off, we can suspend it, we can reset it. And we've also got snapshot capabilities like we have in vCenter. So if we want to take a snapshot before maybe we do some updates, we can do that. If we need to roll back that snapshot or delete it, we can do that as well. But ultimately, a lot of the management is really going to be done from the console. So if I launch a console here, we can see what it looks like to actually log into a virtual machine and do the normal day-to-day administration that we would have. So once I have that window open, we can see this is a Windows 2008 server. Once that's available, I can open this up and log in with the username and password. Just like we would normally in the data center, but again, we're doing this via a browser and not through a vSphere client. So this is good for a variety of management scenarios. If we don't have to have the vSphere client installed on our machine, we can do this remotely. And again, for DR or other remote management scenarios, that's really beneficial. So that's really the high level view of what the vCloud Air interface really has within it. I mean, there's a ton of other things we can get into. I mean, network management, vCloud director management. There's a lot of flexibility. I think that's one of the best points of this is if you have vSphere admins that are familiar with the vCloud, the vSphere interface on premises, then they'll see some of the same look and feel a little bit here. We'll note that it is web browser based, so it is different, but a lot of the naming conventions and whatnot are the same. So overall, it's something that's easy to use, and I think also it extends from sort of the SMB partners that we have all the way up to enterprise and sort of Fortune 100. It's easy enough for us to manage and go in and create a virtual machine. I can access the console very simply, or if I need to create more intricate network constructs, upload certain files into vCloud Director and do that more intricate management, I can do that as well. But we'll leave that for another session. Hopefully this has really provided you an overview of what vCloud Air is. So again, being able to understand what the difference is between the different service types, so the dedicated cloud, the VPC, and DR as a service, and then also to understand a little bit more about each of those. So what are the differences in the core offerings? And again, how do we kind of keep those in mind as we're talking to customers? And then understanding that service subscription model. So we buy the core offering, and then what can we add on that and sort of that building block piece. And then again, really differentiating how vCloud Air differentiates between other public cloud models in the move portion. We don't have to migrate, we don't have to convert, and how much time that saves a customer. And they have that flexibility. They don't have to, they can move a workload out to vCloud Air and move it back as needed. It's much more flexible than some of the other offerings that we see. And then finally, hopefully this quick overview of the interface gives you that visual as to what the interface looks like, what customers are going to see, what questions they may have. In future sessions, we'll dive a little bit more deeply into what that management of vCloud Air is. But hopefully this session has been helpful, and please be on the lookout for other videos. Thanks.